Hello, it's the end of the week. We've gotten through the week, and now for some people it's the weekend. I've been in a mental hospital for the last year, so I don't really have weekends as such. I've been having some more musings on this film I want to make. I want to try and write a screenplay. I've got my laptop, and I don't actually have Microsoft 365 anymore. I better get that. I've got Game Pass for this new TV. Got a laptop and a telly over there, which I'm very lucky to have. But I don't have a copy of Word or the Microsoft Office suite. That's irrelevant anyway. So where I'm at, I've been vegetarian for about the last 6 months since I've been in this hospital. I was in a hospital in Warrington before, and I was still eating meat there. But since I've been in Signet, I've mostly been a vegetarian, and not strictly vegetarian. I had a tuna wrap today. I sometimes have tuna and mayo. I try and be vegan. I eat vegan cheese, but I do still eat eggs, and I have still eaten cheese. I had a jacket potato with cheese yesterday for my lunch. So the central themes, like being vegetarians, made me think about the importance that we attach to the kind of linear progression of our food chain, and how movies like Silence of the Lambs, I don't know if that made anyone else want to be vegetarian. Like when I saw it, it was kind of like quite strong vegetarian vibes. I think there's a special kind of sort of visceral impedance of instinct that comes when you're kind of faced with the reality of the meat industry, and that's kind of best expressed, I think, through cases, or not expressed, but kind of like highlighted and exaggerated in cases of cannibalism. So in my film, like, there's a central character, this female, who gets her two daughters taken off her and fed to her. And whether it's like your parents or your children, and whether it's kind of, like I was thinking in this earlier scene, there's like a dude in this film who originally gets fed his murdered parents by people who swap out the mincemeat in his fridge, and they kind of mock the whole thing and make like kind of a whole song and dance about being kind of smug and enjoying the satisfaction and the dehumanizing humiliation that kind of brings them. But whether it's kind of without knowing, without realizing, or in a much more sort of disturbing and sort of, in the film, sort of protagonistic sense, the act of consuming your murdered relatives is designed to sort of shock and displease. And I think that in that there's a kind of the emotion that it brings up. If you've seen Silence of the Lambs, you probably have. It really is a very powerful movie, and it didn't exactly make me want to turn vegetarian, but it did have like a profound effect on me when I think about the meat industry, and I think about, like, what if that was somebody that you loved. And in this film, these people kind of still command respect and dignity. Like, they act under a veil of innocence, where it's kind of like they're not complete scum. They're, righteous, upstanding individuals who try to maintain, their innocence throughout the film, and eventually just get away with it. And it's all very much facilitated by a huge network of sort of socio-economic power structures and fraternalistic connections. Nothing against the Freemasons. I've seen quite a lot of good stuff on Facebook from Freemasons recently. I've really changed my opinion. I don't want to be one, but nothing necessarily implied there with fraternalistic, but just in a gang sense, like that sort of sense of collective power that doesn't ever want to be held accountable and thinks that it has some right to be offended or have some kind of righteous indignation, even if it's unintended kind of accidental shit. They still kind of try and hold some shred of absurd moral superiority. And I woke up last night, middle of the night. I'd been having some pretty funky dreams, and I started writing this bit of writing. I'll read it. Here you go. Cruelty, greed, evil, selfishness, and lies. These, your core values embodied before we were old enough to read, all operated in a vacuum of accountability, enabled and facilitated by a corrupt society that simply didn't care. Decades passed before you gained the panacea of vengeance, a core tenet you could splice with your cruelty, greed, evil, and selfishness, allowing you to apply a sick, warped banner of moral righteousness to your revolting behaviour, whilst still operating in your abhorrent vacuum of accountability and now responsibility, still enabled and facilitated by a corrupt society that simply didn't care. In time, you branched out with murders, torture, thievery, and a bit more paedophilia to add to the mix of your now decades-old campaign of cruelty, greed, evil, selfishness, and lies. Still operating in your indomitable vacuum of accountability and responsibility, and now without fear of reprisal, all thanks to still being enabled and facilitated by a corrupt society that simply didn't care. Later, things got a little more challenging. For a moment, it looked as though the scarred, traumatised victims of your revolting behaviour might be onto something. The cruelty, greed, evil, selfishness and lies were beginning to be exposed, but then, in its finest hour, the corrupt society that simply didn't care hooked out the big guns. Oh, what a relief that was. Eventually, the scarred, traumatised hosts of your parasitic legacy shattered your vacuum of accountability, responsibility and warped moral righteousness, demanding justice and, most terrifyingly of all, that you personally take ownership for your own actions. The corrupt society that simply didn't care was now sitting up and paying attention. It appeared as though the game might finally be up. The decades of revolting crimes were finally to be the subject of consequence. Accountability and atonement for your actions were seemingly here to be addressed. Now the cruelty, greed, selfishness and lies were being brought into sharp moral focus, and it seemed they weren't going anywhere. As an unexpected, visceral tragedy unfolded, one broken, scarred, traumatised victim of this sickening crusade took pity on the army of heartless, cruel, greedy, selfish, evil liars, and not wanting to succumb, to become a mirror image of those who'd taken everything from him, lowering himself to their level, wallowing as they had in the exacting of harrowing, disproportionate retribution, and fearing that basking in the infectious, demented aura of the suffering of innocence and the repugnant indifference his opponents had so eloquently demonstrated in all its horror would be beyond reprise, set them free from the illusion he'd woven, and duly fell on his sword. So then the traumatised and scarred exemplifications of the vestiges of their own ethically malformed, demented monstrosity, unable to recover from the reaction they knew they were in part responsible for creating, another monster grown in their own image, reverted back to the murder of innocence, a little more cannibalism for extra zeal, and what little comfort they could garner from the reinstatement of their beloved vacuum of accountability, responsibility, and blame, inculcated by a corrupt society that simply didn't care. Only now, with the overbearing weight of their own conscience searing into their souls a fragmented dissonance, one of both an inescapable affectation of culpability and the accompanying delusional belief that they could continue to rape, torture, and dehumanize the innocent with impunity. There is comfort in peace, wisdom in reconciliation, and grace in forgiveness, but without the wholesome discipline of radical acceptance, only the inevitability of irrevocable doom, which is set to befall those who betray themselves to the darkness, allowing their consciousness to be consumed by the savagery of war and the unavoidable moral deterioration that goes with it, shall prevail. I had some pretty weird dreams last night. It's a bit of a kind of fragmented conceptual bit of writing that I don't know if I'm really good enough to put anything on Substack at the moment. And I don't really know, like storyboarding is quite difficult. I don't know about sort of storyboarding or how to write scripts or screenplays. If anyone does, then like get in touch with me, because I don't want to make it like a campaign for vegetarianism or necessarily a film just about cannibalism. But once that cannibalism has taken place, it's a pivotal point in the film, and what I want to kind of express is the way that changes things, the way that sort of before the sort of main protagonists in the film are fed their murdered relatives, there's like this power play of moral receivership and dignity and agency. But after that, the whole thing is just sort of shattered, and any kind of decency or kind of righteousness that these sort of bad guys, but sort of just like normal guys had, is sort of diminished. And it's at that point, you start to look at the sort of delineation of, the food supply and the way that is subconsciously something that we don't really think about. Like when I eat, a chicken and mayonnaise sandwich, I don't think about chicken, not for a nanosecond. Like they had ham, egg and chips on the ward earlier on. I noticed the nurse going up for seconds of these big chunky slices of bacon, butcher's bacon that they were serving. So I didn't eat any of, and wasn't really tempted by the smell. But it kind of made me think about the way that none of those people are thinking about pigs, as they're eating pork, and how that fits into mental health. Is eating meat like a perversion or a sort of delusional abstraction of morality or ethics? Does it have a kind of, does meat or the kind of concept of death being involved with a meal and the mass acceptance of this by like the majority of the world are omnivores? I don't know what the stats are on vegetarianism, but there ain't that many of us. Most people are omnivorous, and I thought, I'll keep you updated. I'll try and write some storyboards and some more conceptual, maybe like broad brushstrokes of what I want this film to be about. I haven't really thought of any working titles yet. But yeah, I am still eating tuna and eggs and occasionally a bit of cheese, but no meat. since well, I've eaten meat a few times since I've been here, but yeah, I'd like to kind of explore those things, because I think that actually it's one of those things that if you really triggered it in the minds of enough people to fully appreciate and understand that, we're all kind of living in this sort of ideological vacuum where we don't think about, like, I used to eat loads of sausages, loads of mince, loads of chicken, you know, every day for I'm almost 40 years old. I'm 39 years old, and for most of my life I've eaten meat, and I've been a chef, and like in 3 different places. I've never once really, thought about farmyard animals. I worked at a company, the Well Hung Meat Company in Buckfastleigh. I worked with them for like about 6 months, and that I was vegetarian for a couple of years after that. Nothing to do with them, or their products are brilliant, and they, like Camilla Parker Bowles and Tom Parker Bowles were regular customers, so they said. So we used to say on the phone, and yeah, like I always talked about, on the phone as a business development exec or a sales exec. I was selling meat at one point, and that was my job, And I never thought, I thought about we used to talk about the good welfare standards of the animals, the way that they're raised in such a good way, and that, they're grass fed and outdoor reared and all that kind of shit. And like, it was like there was never any morbidity in my work day. My thoughts never drifted into the idea of mortality or ethics at all. Like, it was like, we sell meat boxes. Do you want to buy, do you want one? How many packs of sausages do you want? How many chickens do you want? Not ever a kind of a realistic view. And if we are, there's a lot more vegans than there used to be. It's become a very Shoreditch, Brick Lane kind of, decaf soya chai latte and, a vegan bagel is the hipsters' kind of Instagram fodder of choice these days. I mean, they're, matcha tea and spelt bread. Go to St. Werburgh's in Bristol, it's sourdough and locally sourced vegetables all the way. But, that isn't, I guess, a representation of a naivety or an absence of the consciousness which motivates vegetarianism. I mean, I would say it's becoming more prevalent, and that's why I think I want to bring it into focus, because I think that once, there's already a captive audience who are much more sort of morally guided about their food and the way that the things that they eat have a kind of footprint, and that's cool, but still a massive minority. I don't think necessarily framing it as like, family members in a horror movie is like an evangelical expression of, of anything really, but it's designed, I hope, to sort of spark a bit of a internal questioning, because like one guy doesn't realise he's eating his family, and the other person is like much more brutally kind of involved in witnessing the whole thing. So you've got this kind of, one of them's ignorant to it and the other one is exposed to it, and so there's a sort of dichotomy and a cosplay between those two parallels of both having a source of meat which they sort of post-traumatically understand is come from a place that causes a deep amount of hurt and, inconceivable trauma, and also the way that, the perpetrators represent the omnivorous populace, that they they feel that there is nothing wrong with their actions, or that they're still entitled to kind of like, I mean, to anything at all other than, people, you don't get vegetarians attacking farmers, and I wouldn't condone that or encourage it, like, but, in a sense, I do sympathise with like animal rights campaigners who do kind of bad stuff, like, not bad stuff, but direct action. They take direct action, But it's one of those things that sort of represents a bit of a wider moral narrative. Like, you get everything you buy in Tesco's. Like walking through Tesco's, you've got to have a kind of absence of mind. Are these Kenyan fine beans fairly traded, and have they degraded the topsoil in the monoculture farming Kenya, where the petrochemicals agribusiness industry has completely decimated the nutrients, and contracted one farmer to grow all these fine beans for Tesco, all of Tesco's stores, and ruined his farmland and extorted him in the process. You don't. Co-op have banned Israeli goods now, which I think is pretty good. Like, Co-op don't sell Israeli products anymore. But how many of us look at that fucking label anyway? Do you know what I mean? Like, when you're just pushing your trolley and you're looking at all the different products and you're putting them all into your trolley, like, I don't. Like, maybe it is, I'm just talking for myself. Like, I guess more conscientious people do, but once you put the items in there, you never look in the veg aisle, like, where was this broccoli grown? Like, where did these bird's eye peas originate from? And you can buy organic in the supermarket. I used to buy all my food from Abel and Cole, which are like a bit like Riverford Farm in Devon. They're just a big organic food supplier. And after I worked at the Wellhung Meat Company, I had all my organic food. My mum's boyfriend was quite touching the way I used to make organic meals, and I'd offer him some of it, and he'd be like, "Oh, sounds very healthy, nice and healthy," which basically in his vernacular meant it was a bit rank. If any food that was healthy, good for you, probably wasn't that tasty. But yeah, like, I want to kind of highlight that mass indoctrination, where it's becoming more popular, and I think it will be popular with people who are promoting vegan lifestyles and looking at things from a perspective of ethics and fairly traded source and environmental impact too. But the central narrative's got to be kind of cold and harsh and shocking, because it tells a story that ultimately I think sort of represents a wider truth that people need to know about. And in time, I guess, with the weight of public opinion and the turning tides of woke culture, whatever you think of that, will probably gain a bit more traction, cover a bit more ground, and be the sort of thing more people will be receptive to. But it's got to be sort of shocking and scary and harrowing. And it's important to represent the way that these people still have, like the perpetrators of the murders are still kind of like, they're very easily offended, and they even take offence when there's no intention there. And like, it's kind of, how does the, protagonist or the protagonists kind of react to this sort of stupendous absurdity of any kind of righteousness? It's like, it speaks about our own ambivalence and, psychological dissonance that we have when we're walking through Tesco, Anyway, that's 25 minutes. Don't know what I'm doing today. not much for the weekend. I hope you all have a nice weekend, everybody. I hope that you listen to Jonathan Pye on Threads, because he's really interesting. And think somebody has lost the plot. Maybe I've lost the plot. But yeah, have a good weekend, innit? And don't do anything I wouldn't do.